Society. Let me just make sure. With Valley Forge Audubon Society, and I'm really happy to have our presentation for this evening from Jay Kelly. A little bit of a couple housekeeping items first for everybody. The first is that we are going to be recording this, and so if you don't want to be recorded, just to let you know that we will be taping this and playing it back again. And then the second thing is we ask that you mute yourself and to take off your video. We want to preserve the bandwidth for the presentation here. And one of the things I was talking to Jay a little bit about at the beginning before we started the presentation is just how important this presentation is, especially for what we are dealing with in southeastern Pennsylvania with our bird populations and the impacts of the deer and the invasive plants. It's probably one of the most important programs that we all have to hear, because it really, what is taking place is really impacting our bird species. And just a little bit of a side note, I was doing a preparation for our bird count this weekend at a preserve in which I hadn't been there for 15 years. And when I went back this past week, the amount of changes in the forest are so significant, and the loss of the bird species within that original forest community is significant. Birds that used to nest there, black and white warbler, veeries, Kentucky warbler, and there is no sign of those species, and part of the reason has to do with Jay's presentation today. So what is going to be presented today is so important for what we are dealing with our bird populations here in southeastern Pennsylvania. So with that, I'm going to introduce Jay Kelly. Is an associate professor of biology and environmental science at Raritan Valley Community College, where he teaches ecology, botany, zoology, and environmental science. He holds a BA in biology and a PhD in ecology and evolution from Rutgers University. His research interests are biology and conservation of rare plant and animal species, coastal and forest ecology, plastic marine debris, and designing and implementing land management practices that balance the needs of humans with other species in the landscape. Dr. Kelly develops community-based research projects and partnerships that benefit both his students and the communities they serve. He received a certificate of special congressional recognition for his research and service in 2010. And with that, Jay, I would like to welcome you and thank you.
Well, thanks for the introduction, Vince, and for the invitation to speak to your group. I share your concerns about these issues and think it is one of the more pressing issues that are facing biodiversity in the region today, and it's one that's too little reported and understood by the public, media, politicians alike. So we started this project in 2013 in partnership with New Jersey Audubon. Dr. Nelly Sapora there and I teamed forces to try to tackle this issue in central New Jersey, to try to get a handle on how deer and invasive plant species are impacting our forests. There's been a pretty good awareness about these issues for at least the past 30 years, at least in the scientific community, but there hasn't been a lot of concrete data from local areas that can contribute to how we're managing our local parks and preserves, or to developing policy and other solutions to tackle these things at the local or state or regional level. And so we saw that being a major gap that we could help fill, and we were fortunate to get a National Science Foundation grant to really start to forge a path in that direction. Using our students to study the vegetation in central and northern New Jersey, and Audubon worked with citizen scientists to study the bird populations in those same forests. So much of what I'm going to be showing you today is from our side of the story, the vegetation dynamics that have been happening out there. Our bird data is still in the process of being analyzed, but I will share some of that with you. But much of that, I think, story remains to be told. And in compensation for not having as much bird data of our own to share with you, I'll be relating the results of a lot of other scientific studies that have come out of our region. New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Virginia really are the epicenter of where a lot of research has been going on, looking into the effects of deer on bird species. And so we're fortunate to have a pretty good array of studies to learn from and try to piece together to see what the bigger picture looks like. So just to take a step back before we dive into what's happening here at the local level, it's important to recognize that the abundance of deer that we're seeing in New Jersey or Pennsylvania is not unique to these areas, that this is part of not just a regional phenomenon, but a continent scale increase in deer populations. Locally, we have the white-tailed deer species, and out west there's mule and black-tailed deer, and they're exhibiting similar patterns as you see illustrated here. This is harvest statistics from different states where the white-tailed deer occurs in the east, and you can see a really similar trend with populations increasing dramatically by the 1970s and 80s, far higher than levels that they had occurred historically. And the reasons for the deer population increasing in the way it has consistently across the continent is fairly complicated. There's a lot of factors working together. Probably the most important one is the historical extermination of natural predators that took place in this area. That happened by the mid-1800s, where wolves, cougars, and Native Americans, unfortunately, were removed from the landscape at large. Deer populations didn't respond right away because there was also commercial hunting of deer taking place during that time period. And that process actually drove deer to extinction throughout many states east of the Mississippi. And it was really only a century of hard work of regulators and biologists and conservationists and hunters working together to bring back the white-tailed deer population from the brink of extinction. And it really is, from that perspective, a conservation success story. Commercial hunting was banned at the end of the 1800s. But a lot of other things have changed since then that have allowed deer populations to increase far higher than they ever occurred historically, as far as we can tell. And two of those factors include the warming winters that we've had over the past century that in many years are no longer cold enough to kill deer in large numbers. And probably the most significant issue, at least in our area, is the suburban development and fragmentation of forests for both suburban and agricultural uses. And the reason why that's so important is because suburban residential areas in particular, by fragmenting the forest, they increase the amount of edge habitat, which deer prefer. They hide out in the cover of the forest during the daytime, and at night they come out from the forest and feed on our farm fields, our gardens, our landscaping, and so forth out in the open under the cover of night. And on top of that, they have supplemental food resources available to them that didn't occur naturally historically. All the things that we're planting and watering and fertilizing in our yards and in our farm fields are good food for the deer. And so there's more food available for them than historically there was. There's more edge habitat than historically there ever was. There's no predators for them anymore to the same degree. And although hunters do provide some replacement of natural predators, in these suburban areas, it's hunting is difficult to take place or to be successful. And so many of these places are perfect refuges from hunters as well. And so it's really a perfect storm of all these conditions that have allowed for deer populations to increase to the levels that we see today. And the epicenter of this overabundance of deer really is taking place in the Northeast corridor from Boston down to DC and West Virginia, with other hotspots occurring in the Great Lakes region, the Ithaca region, and a few other spots around the country. So this is just looking at some numbers graphically, but you can see the same pattern geographically as well. The first continent-wide assessments of deer populations were done by Aldo Leopold in the 1940s. And the top left map that you see here from the University of Georgia really illustrates what Leopold found during that time period. That around the mid-20th century, there were very few deer throughout much of their historical range, not just in the Southeast, as you see there, but really throughout the eastern states. And the white-tailed deer occur more or less east of the Rocky Mountains, with other species filling their niches to the west of there. But you can see a steady trend of increasing deer populations in the subsequent decades, such that by the 1980s, especially the late 80s, as you see on the right side of the screen here, large areas of the continent were occupied by excessive deer populations. And the red indicates areas that have deer populations of 30 per square mile or more. And I'll talk about the significance of that number in a little bit. Just in case you're not familiar with it, on my screen, there's my own image, and the icons for people on the session are covering the screen, and you can move that around if you click the top of that window in case anything is ever obscuring some of the figures or facts that I'm showing you. You have control over that, hopefully. And so we've got basically widespread continent scale increases in deer populations, and that's causing similar scale impacts on our forests. This is a study from 2018 of the impacts of deer browse on understory vegetation in forests by the US Forest Service. They found that in the mid-Atlantic region where we're located, the forests were suffering the greatest damage, with nearly 80% of our forests experiencing moderate to severe levels of browse. So just to take a step back again to think about what levels deer naturally occur at, where everything is in balance, because they do belong in the forest and serve value. Some species have competitive advantages in growing in the forest, and deer provide some benefit for other plant species by suppressing those competitive plant species and make other niches available. So we do want deer in the forest. They're native, they belong here. We just need them to be in balance with other things that are trying to survive in the forest if we're gonna have the biodiversity flourish in the way that we would all like. So historically, biologists estimate that deer populations occurred at approximately 10 per square mile. And while it's really difficult to figure out exactly what numbers deer occurred at, prehistorically or even in the colonial era, because there's no good data sets available, we know that that's a pretty good target for management, because studies have shown that when deer populations exceed 10 per square mile, you start to see noticeable effects in local ecosystems. And the first thing that tends to happen is the preferred browse species, the things that the deer like to eat the most, begin to decline in the forest. So around here, we have things like trillium, lilies, certain orchid species. Among trees, you have hemlocks, dogwoods, the things that the deer find the tastiest start to decline. When you get to 15 to 20 per square mile, you start to see really widespread impacts happening throughout the forest. The understory vegetation begins to decline as a whole, and the other species that depend on that understory, including insects and arthropods, amphibians, and bird species, begin to decline as well. So on the left picture that you see there, that's an image from central New Jersey in the early 1970s of the Rutgers Research Forest. And you can see a healthy forest environment where all the different layers of the forest are still intact, with ferns and wildflowers on the forest floor, shrubs and young trees growing above them, a nice understory canopy of trees above that, and of course the canopy trees themselves. Unfortunately, today in our area, and I assume in much of the area that you all are coming from, we're seeing patterns that look more or less like the two images on the right, where either everything has been removed from the understory by the deer, except for the tree trunks themselves, or in that vacuum that the deer have created, you find flourishing invasive exotic plant species. And in the image there, it's mostly Japanese barberry and wineberry, but the dominant species will vary locally in each case. So while 10 per square mile is a really good benchmark for management, the goal for us to manage deer so that biodiversity can recover, populations unfortunately greatly exceed those levels. The last statewide estimate of deer populations in New Jersey found deer to occur at about 38 per square mile, and that was 20 years ago. The highest densities occurred in the suburban central parts of New Jersey, where they exceeded 70 per square mile. And our studies using drones and infrared cameras across northern New Jersey in the past 3 years have found deer to continue to rise since that time to, on average, about 80 per square mile. And in that area of central New Jersey that I referenced, the average is 112 per square mile. So deer numbers today in this part of the state and in the more suburban parts of the region as a whole are 10 times the natural background rates that we need for them to be in balance with other things in the ecosystem. So it really translates into utter catastrophes for other things that are trying to live in the forests with them. So our research in New Jersey really takes advantage of the wealth of historical studies that were conducted by Rutgers researchers, where we're extraordinarily fortunate to have. Beginning in the late 1940s, a man named Murray Buell started the plant ecology lab at Rutgers, and it was really the dawn of quantitative ecology. And he set out with his grad students over the next 25 years to study forests throughout northern New Jersey. Basic questions about how forests vary depending on which slope you were on. So we compiled all the studies that we could find, about 22 as a whole, and as best as we could relocate the exact locations where those studies had taken place, and repeated that research so we could see exactly how forests have changed from the mid-20th century to the present day. And there's only one other place in the continent that has this many historical study sites that I'm aware of to make these kinds of comparisons from past to present, and that's Wisconsin. because a colleague of Marie Buell had set up shop over there, and I'm not sure if they were competing with each other, but they were certainly colleagues and had similar interests and were using similar methods. And so we have this, we're incredibly fortunate to have this treasure trove of data, and many of them had really good information that we could pinpoint the locations of where they occurred and make these past to present comparisons. And so the map on the right there is a bit complicated, but essentially all the red dots are places where these historic studies occurred that we were able to find the exact locations and repeat those studies to see how things have changed. The yellow dots are places that we couldn't relocate the exact study sites, and so we didn't collect data there. The light blue dots are places where we added our own sites to the mix just to see how things were affecting forests locally in the Piedmont or central New Jersey region. And the dark blue dots are the locations of long-term, large-scale exposures that we used as controls for our study to see what forests look like after 10 to 20 years if you take deer out of the equation. And again, the beauty of this data set from 1948 to 73 that Murray Buell compiled over his career is that it occurred prior to the deer populations exploding to the levels that we see today. And it was prior to this massive introduction of invasive plant species into the landscape as well. And so it's an invaluable reference data set to look at how forests have changed in relation to those two particular factors. And we're fortunate to have that to draw from. One of the punchlines of our research was focused on tree regeneration, which in many ways is an indication of forest understory vegetation as a whole. I'll get to other types of plant species in a minute. But when you're studying forests, you want to break it up into different size classes because they're going to be responding to different conditions as the trees are growing and increasing in size and age. And those different sizes of trees are going to be more or less vulnerable to deer in the process as well. The most vulnerable size class are seedlings, which are less than a foot tall, but they're not actually a very good indicator of deer populations or their effects because seedlings are continually replenished from the forest canopy. As seeds fall down each year, however many the deer are eating, they're going to continue to replenish themselves. And on top of that, the seedlings will grow during the growing season when we're collecting our data, but the deer typically don't eat them until the winter months afterwards when the herbaceous vegetation has died back. So it's not a very valuable indicator of deer populations. And on top of that, seedlings are very responsive to weather conditions, droughts in a given year. There's masting events where oaks and hickories, for example, flood the system with seeds every 3 to 5 years. And so seedlings, even though it looks like they've declined here from past to present, statistically, that actually wasn't a significant decline. And it would be difficult to make sense of that anyway because of that variation. The two categories that I think are most useful to gauge deer effects are the sapling layer here, trees that are greater than a foot tall, but less than an inch in diameter at 4 feet above the ground. And we see here that in that category, they've declined 80% since the mid-20th century in our region. And they're a particularly good indicator of deer because they're still at the level that the deer can reach their leaves. They're taller than a foot, but typically less than 10 to 15 feet in height. So the deer can access both their leaves and twigs for browse. The bucks will also rub their antlers against them to get rid of the velvet. And we see here, as we would expect, the greatest declines in that category from past to present. The small tree category is interesting because the deer can't actually access those leaves. A tree that's 1 inch to 4 inches in diameter has its leaves typically more than 15 feet up above the ground. So the deer can't browse them. But the reason why we expect to see these kinds of declines in that category is because the deer populations have been excessive for so long that the depletion of the sapling layer has led to depletion ultimately of the small trees. So that as the small trees are growing up and becoming medium or large sized trees, or they're dying off, there just aren't enough saplings anymore to fill their ranks and replace them. So that's predictable when you've got deer populations at the levels that we've seen for the past 40 years or so in our area, because these small trees are typically anywhere from 15 to 40 years old. The scary thing is that if these trends continue, we're going to see the same sorts of declines happening in the medium and the large tree categories because they're not going to live forever either. And we're actually seeing this play out at small scales in our area. And I gather from yours as well, from talking to Vince before the presentation today. Each of these smaller categories fills the ranks of the next as they grow up and age over time, and the ones that are already present there die off. And as our forests are falling victim to all kinds of other factors, in particular invasive pests and diseases, there aren't enough young trees growing up underneath them to replace them. So this is 2 examples of forest patches around here that were dominated by ashes. The emerald ash borer completely wiped them out in our area. and there's no young trees growing up beneath them. It's either a tangle of invasive shrubs and vines that you see on the left there, or on the right you see herbaceous plants like Japanese stiltgrass and other herbs. And so this is happening at small scales right now, and the concern is that if these trends continue and we can't tackle deer populations and bring them down at the scales that they're happening, that we're going to start to lose forests at much larger rates and scales in the future, as if there wasn't enough things affecting. And all I've essentially shown you is that there's dramatic declines from past to present. I haven't given any conclusive information that deer are necessarily the cause of that. All we know is that there's a correlation of deer populations increasing at the same time. So we wanted to do our deer populations in the places that we were measuring the forests. And when you put those things together, you can see really close relationships between local deer densities. As you see on the left graph there, deer per square kilometer on the bottom x-axis, and the number of saplings per hectare, which is just a metric measurement of acreage. And you can see that as soon as deer populations reach even minimal levels above that carrying capacity, the saplings just completely disappear from the forest, and in some places are next to zero. The second piece of information that we did was look at changes in species composition in the trees. Deer prefer eating some trees over others. So if deer are the primary driving force behind these declines, we would expect to see increases in the species that deer eat the least of, that they find the least palatable, and decreases in the species that they find the tastiest. And that's exactly what we found. In those two categories that I showed you that have declined the most, the saplings and the small tree layers, you see dramatic increases in the least tastiest plants from past to present, which is, again, just an additional source of information to confirm our understanding that deer are a cause here. I'm sorry, my dog is scratching at my doors. It's a little distracting. But that's still not enough to really point the finger at deer. And what you need in science is controlled studies to really exclude other potential causes of what you're looking at and narrow down the causes of interest. And the way to do that in the case of deer is to look at long-term deer exposures. And we're fortunate to have had about 12 that we were able to locate to collect data from to see how the forest responded in the absence of deer for 10 to 20 years. And we only picked exposures that were larger than a few acres in size, exposures that were open to the public. And so everything else that is affecting our forests was still taking place in these forests. People were walking on trails. You know, the climate is still changing in these places. Invasive pests and diseases are still affecting these forests. All the other things that are degrading our forests are still occurring there. The only thing that's changed is deer have been removed from the equation. And when you do that, you can see that the sapling and the small tree layer respond to nearly identical levels as we saw occurring historically after 12 to 16 years. The sapling layer was found to recover to identical levels historically at 12 years. And because it takes a little more time to reach the level of small trees, it took about 16 to 17 years for levels to rise up to historical numbers there. You compare those to surrounding forests that are comparable on similar soils and in similar landscape contexts, and you see without those kinds of protections from deer, you see the same sort of depletion in the understory with saplings and small trees nearly gone. And so this is, I think, the most conclusive data set to really confirm that deer are one of the primary driving factors of these declines in tree regeneration in forest understories in general that we've been able to document from past to present in New Jersey. And the photos on the right there are from one of the exposures that we looked at. The largest exposure is at Duke Farms in Hillsborough, New Jersey, where they have a square mile size deer exposure that they've been maintaining since 2004. And the recovery of the forest in these places is just mind-blowing, seeing the density of trees that are occurring. And, you know, it's in intact canopies, so it's not like it's all light gaps and the trees are just growing in open light. There's complete intact canopies overhead and the trees are still growing up underneath them. So light is not a limiting factor. It's really just taking deer out of the equation that allows these trees to grow and recover to those historic levels. So, you know, we're obviously concerned with more than just the trees in the forest. Many things are depending upon the trees and vegetation in general. that's the bottom of the food chain. So we would expect to see declines in things like the insects that are feeding on the vegetation, as well as the birds that are feeding on the insects, the berries, and so forth, or that are nesting in the vegetation. And we've seen similar alarming trends taking place over the past 50 to 60 years. There's been recent studies showing dramatic declines in bird populations since the 1960s and 70s, with forest birds declining about 17% on average since that time period. And insect populations have declined to even greater degrees worldwide, not just in the United States, but in Europe and everywhere else where data sets are available at this point. And these are alarming trends. And unfortunately, again, it's a complicated subject and there's a lot of causes at work here. It's of course not just deer that's affecting our forest birds or insects. We have, loss of habitat in their breeding and wintering grounds, problems with migration and bird strikes for cell towers and turbines. You've got cats in the forests that are impacting them as well, these domestic cats that people don't keep indoors. Pesticides, there's a wide range of things affecting bird populations as well as insects. So I don't want to give the impression that I'm blaming deer for everything. But deer are part of this equation. And because it's more of a subtle and indirect effect, it's one that doesn't get as much attention in the way that it deserves. So we're fortunate again that so much research has been done for so long in this area of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. Most of the studies that I'm aware of on the effects of deer on bird populations occurred in really just those 3 states to a great degree. And the first study that really looked at it systematically was conducted in Northwest Pennsylvania by DiColesta, who worked for the US Forest Service. And he had 4 large-scale deer exclosures where he looked at changing, they actually maintained deer at different abundances or densities within the deer exclosures. I'm sorry, I think there were 8 exclosures and 4 different densities. They kept them in, I can't recall the details. But there were 4 densities from low to high, and they measured changes in vegetation over 10 years. And then in 1991, he went in and studied the bird populations in those places. So they had really good vegetation data to draw from, and then looked at how bird population changed in response. And what DiColesta found in this first kind of groundbreaking study was dramatic declines consistently across those density levels of the intermediate canopy nesting birds. And it was surprising that he didn't see similar declines in ground nesting birds, but that's what he found in that first study. And when you get above the middle level of deer there, 7.9 deer per square kilometer, which translates into about 20 per square mile, he saw no more wood peewees, indigo buntings, least flycatchers, yellow-billed cuckoos, or cerulean warblers. They just completely disappeared from forests where the deer densities were higher than that. And so he pointed to 20 per square mile or so as a valuable threshold for thinking about how to manage forests for bird populations. Later on in the 1990s, we had a study nearby in Northern Virginia, near Shenandoah National Park and the Smithsonian Research Center, out there looking at 8 different 10-acre sites. So it's a smaller scale study, but they looked at basically similar sorts of things. They had exclosures throughout the 1990s and measured the bird responses to them. And they found really close responses of especially the understory birds, the birds that were nesting in the understory and or foraging there, with vegetation cover in those places. And the vegetation cover, of course, was responding to the deer exclosures. So there was really clear effects there for a variety of forest guilds, but primarily the low and intermediate forest species. And as an aside, if anybody's interested in looking into these studies in more detail, I'd be happy to share a reference list with you or the individual studies if you don't have access to them as well. So please just let me know if that's something that you'd be interested in. Taking a much kind of more comprehensive look at this, this study took place in the Allegheny National Forest in Northwest PA in about 10 years ago, where they looked at, again, these exclosures where deer populations had been maintained at different levels, and they looked at changes in vegetation and how that translated into changes in the insect communities, and again, how that changed the bird communities in response. And the 30 deer per square kilometer that you see there translates into about 65 to 70 deer per square mile. And you can see that when you get to those levels, tree diversity declined by 60%. The caterpillars, which are herbivores that are often very specific to certain plant species that they prefer to eat, they declined the greatest amongst the insects of 80% over the same levels of deer populations. and bird populations declined about 40%. Many of our forest birds are insectivores or depend on insects for particular parts of their life cycle, feeding their nestlings, for example, even if they're primarily a frugivorous or in other places a nectivorous bird. And then other studies by Chips in 2015 looked at just changes in the insect communities as a whole and found across the board, average insect populations declined by 40 to 50%. So we're seeing dramatic changes to the forests that ecologists refer to as cascade effects, which cascade is a waterfall. So a change in one level of the food chain translates into changes that you can follow all the way through, with one thing leading to another. Either up the food chain from effects to the vegetation, or down the food chain if you're talking about something like the removal of wolves, how that leads to increases in deer, and so forth. Here in New Jersey at the Rutgers Research Forest, some friends of mine that I knew from grad school studied bird populations there and compared breeding bird population data from the 1980s to the present. And they were interested in seeing if bird populations had increased or decreased depending upon where they were nesting in the forest. And they broke the different species up into categories of canopy nesters, mid-story nesters, and shrub or ground nesters. And the graph that you see there on the left, any dot is the trend over that time period for an individual species. If it's a large circle, it's a significant trend. If it's small, it was not a significant trend statistically. And if it's below the line, it means that the species declined. And you can see that 100% of the shrub and ground nesting birds in the Hutchinson Research Forest there had declined since the 1980s, and the majority of the mid-story nesters had as well. Whereas the canopy nesting species were largely unaffected, and some of them actually significantly increased since that time period. So that's just one little 40-acre forest in the middle of New Jersey. Just last year, a much larger scale study came out of Pennsylvania using the same types of data, looking at breeding bird data sets with the USGS data sets from Pennsylvania, and looking at how bird populations changed since the 1980s. And you can see really interesting similar trends here. The black line shows the increase in deer population since the 1980s, and they broke up the bird population, or bird species, into different categories of generalist species, early successional forest species, and forest interior or forest older class forest species, and broke each of those categories up depending upon whether they nested low in the forest understory or higher up in the canopy. And you can see that whether it's forest interior species for mature forests or early successional forests, the bird populations that are nesting close to the ground have declined much more than other bird species in our forests in correlation with rising deer population, which is what we would expect to see. Again, they're not looking at causal relationship, but overall general patterns that you would see at that large scale. But the data lines up pretty clearly in this case from Pennsylvania. And this is a nice study that just came out late last year. And if you want to take a closer look at with a fine-tooth comb at the data, this is showing the trends by category here. You can see again, the low nesting forest, mature forest species declined the most, the low nesting early successional species after that, and then the other species that either nested higher up or more generalist in their habitat preferences didn't seem to fare one way or another, and in some cases were positive. And I took again a subset of the data of those species that declined the most on the right there, in case you want to see which species have declined the greatest amount since the 1980s from that data set. These trends are not unique to this area either. So this is a study from the other end of the continent, all the way out in the islands outside of Washington State and Vancouver Island. This study looked at 18 different islands in the archipelago out there by Vancouver, where both black-tailed deer, which is native to that area, as well as introduced fallow deer species, had risen to dramatic levels in some of the islands. And they looked at the understory vegetation again and how bird populations responded. And they broke the islands up into categories by deer density. And you can see that the islands with low deer densities had lush, Northwest Pacific rainforest vegetation occurring there. Moderate deer densities, or medium levels, I should say, had some signs of degradation, but there was still at least vegetation in the understory. And the places with high levels of deer were just obliterated with essentially nothing growing there. And they found that bird populations in the low deer density islands were larger on average, as you can see on the top graph. And on the bottom graph, the species that exhibited the greatest declines in abundance were those that were most dependent on the understory, as you can see from left to right there. Again, as you'd expect. And only one species out of all the species they studied actually increased in relation to the high levels of deer. And interestingly, that was the dark-eyed junco. I'm not sure why, but that's what they found. Looking at the continent as a whole, this study looked at deer populations, including white-tailed deer, black-tailed deer, and mule deer across the entire continent of North America, and looked at a subset of 73 forest bird species that had been described systematically as either affected by deer or sensitive to deer impacts, or insensitive to them. And if you look on the graph there, what they found is that from left to right, you see increasing deer populations or states that have increasing deer populations. And the proportion of species that are at risk or declining in those states, amongst those that are insensitive to deer, they don't change from state to state depending upon deer populations at all. The species that are sensitive to deer with the gray bars there, greater and greater proportions of those species are declining in relation to increasing deer populations as you go from state to state or region to region in North America. And so we're seeing, again, it's correlational, but it's really large scale patterns that are playing out across the landscape that ultimately all point to the same kinds of driving factors. We've eliminated predators from most of the continent. We have suburbanizing populations of people all over the continent and the world at this point. There's similar trends taking place everywhere, as well as other factors as well. And it's not even just North America. There's been a lot of studies coming out of England and Great Britain as well. This one looked at the 3 most abundant deer populations and how they changed from 1995 and 2006. There's 3 different species of deer that all increased during that time period. And they found that 45% of the understory species that they studied in those areas declined significantly in response, or at least at the same time as those deer populations increased. And again, they also measured vegetation, so you can see decreasing vegetation and decreasing in the understory birds as well, including species that are very similar to our own, like the song thrush and the willow tit that you see there looks a lot like our chickadee, but also others that we don't have, like the nightingale, which I'm sure would be lovely to hear or see. All right, so that's just a quick review of the studies that I'm aware of that looked at relationships with deer to bird populations. But there's other more complicated indirect effects as well. And the second major area of concern that we investigated in our research is looking at the increase in exotic invasive plant species. This is another group of species that have increased dramatically over the past century. The map on the right there shows areas with the highest concentrations of exotic species at this point. This is from the Biota of North America project, or bonap.org, which there's amazing information there for plants if you're interested. And the areas in blue show the places with the highest densities of exotic invasive plant species across the continent. And the highest densities occur primarily in the east, in that northeast corridor from Boston down to DC, as well as in the San Francisco Bay, the Los Angeles Basin, and outside Seattle. And invasive species cause a wide range of effects of concern, but the one that's closest to home for our interest here with bird populations has to do with their effects on insect species. So again, insect herbivores are very specific about what they choose to eat. Many of them are relying on chemical cues to decide what's appropriate food or not. And Doug Tallamy, an entomologist at the University of Delaware, has done extraordinary research over the past 20 years looking at these kinds of issues, comparing our native and invasive flora and the extent to which those different species provide food resources for insect herbivores. And he's primarily interested in caterpillars of moth and butterfly species. So I just took a subset of some of the data that he had produced from his research to illustrate the general concepts. And essentially, if you take 2 species in the elm family, our native elms, and compare them to exotic elm species, the Zelkova, that have been introduced as a landscape tree, they look very similar, and my botany students often get confused by them, at least initially. But so they're green and they're valuable and they're beautiful trees in their own right. But if you look at what kind of food resources they're providing to our insects, it's next to none. So our native elms are feeding over 200 different species of moths and butterflies, according to Tallamy's research, compared to the introduced Zelkova species from Asia that supports none, at least that he found in his study. And if you look at the shrub layer, I just picked 2 species from the rose family as an example. Our native meadow sweets, he found to support dozens of different moths and butterflies, whereas the invasive sorbaria or false spirea, he found to support only 2. And these trends persist for over 100 years in many cases, because it takes a long time for our own native wildlife species to shift gears and realize that a lot of these introduced species can provide food resources. And so even after 300 years of some species being introduced to this continent, they still only provide food for a small, 8 to 10 different species of native moth and butterfly caterpillars. So eventually nature will catch up and evolution will run its course, but for our lifespans, we're not going to see, we shouldn't expect to see major changes in these species providing food for wildlife. So while they provide some value in sequestering carbon, filtering water, being lush and green and lovely, in terms of wildlife resources, for insects and herbivores in particular, they might as well not be there at all. It's a desert for those species. And so just like with deer, we saw cascade effects trickling through the food web. Some studies have begun to find similar things with invasive species as well. This is a recent study from 2 years ago, I believe, in Connecticut, looking at forests infested with Japanese barberry, and they found dramatic declines in those forests in herbivore insect biomass and species richness, declines in the detritivores, the species that are eating the decaying matter beneath those plants, as well as the insect predators that are preying upon those insects. And so we're seeing the same kinds of declines cascading through the insect levels of the food web, which eventually will make their way to birds as well. Our own research looking at the changes in plant species in forest understories from past to present found what you'd expect to see based on what we saw from the tree regeneration results. Dramatic declines in the native shrubs, the woody vines, which we call lianas, and the native herbs, including all the herbaceous plants, grasses, ferns, sedges, wildflowers, and so forth. And at the same time as those declines took place, we saw dramatic increases in invasive shrubs, lianas, and herbs take place. And so again, they're filling those niches as the deer are suppressing our native plant species growth. Just looking at the past data set, if you were walking around in the forests in 1950 in New Jersey, this is what you would see. The vast majority of species present in the understory were native. And even in the worst case scenarios, most of these invasive plant species only reached 3 or 5% cover in forests in New Jersey, with the exception being Japanese honeysuckle. There were 2 forests where it reached nearly 20% cover during that time period. You go to those same places today, and the invasives are equally abundant as the natives in the cases of shrubs and lianas. And the worst case scenarios are far worse, with Japanese honeysuckle now reaching as much as 95% cover in some of these forest understories, and many of the other species dramatically increasing as well. And on top of that, the black species that the black text there indicates species that were in the previous slide that were present in the mid-20th century. The gray text indicates species that weren't present back then, but are now abundant in the landscape. So we're introducing new species more and more into our forests through our landscaping and other courses that weren't even present back then. So this is just the beginning of really a radical transformation in the species composition of our forests that's already well underway, with our forest understories essentially looking completely different than they did 50 to 70 years ago as a result of these pressures. There's other things going on besides deer. So deer are suppressing the native species, but the invasives are also responding to other factors. And one of them is the historical disturbance of soils by agriculture. In New Jersey, we have maps going back to 1899 of forest cover in northern New Jersey, which you can see on the top left there. This is the region that I'm located in. And the green indicates places that were covered in forest back then. The white is essentially a farm field at that time. But in the 20s and 30s, farms began to go out of business for economic reasons. And as farm fields were abandoned, they returned to forest cover. And so we actually have seen dramatic recovery of forests throughout the region over the past 100 years compared to the late 1800s. The problem is that the forests that occur in those disturbed soils are very different than the intact forests or the forests occurring on intact soils. And so the previous slides I showed you on the top left there, these are intact forests that we had studied from past to present. If you look at these young post-agricultural forests growing on disturbed soils, invasive species are twice as abundant or more in those forests as they are in the intact forests. And so that's very much of concern. And this, you can learn to see this and pick this out in the landscape really easily. I'll get back to that later. This is a slide, just a picture I took walking on a trail in New Jersey, where the trail transitioned from an old forest crossed an old stone wall, which I tried to highlight there, and passed into a younger forest growing on a post-agricultural farm field. And you can see that on the left, there's nothing growing in the understory where the soils are intact, but the deer have destroyed everything. And on the right side, you can see that it's full of vegetation, but 100% of that is exotic invasive plant species. And so the trees are smaller, there's more light in the forest, but the other thing that's really noticeable is that the invasives are super abundant, and that's related to that history of soil disturbance and the changes in soil nutrients, soil carbon, soil texture, that these particular plant species appear to favor compared to the intact soils, where there might be agents in the soil that are preventing their germination or growth, or that just aren't conducive in other ways. And the alarming thing in New Jersey is the scale that these forests occur at. So we did an analysis of in a GIS study looking at how much of these forests in northern New Jersey today are intact forests that were present as forests in the late 1800s versus those that have recovered from abandoned agricultural activities. And you can see that today, more than 40% of our forest acreage in northern New Jersey is comprised of these post-agricultural forests that are twice as abundant or full of invasive plant species as they are of native species. So this is really a major priority for conservation, for forest restoration in the coming decades, and hopefully people that are working on this stuff have this in mind and are willing to invest the kinds of resources that we need to tackle these problems at scale. But in addition to figuring out solutions at scale of how to get rid of invasives and suppress them so our natives can come back, how to suppress deer at the same scale, we also need policy solutions to prevent the continual introduction of new species into the landscape as well. Today, there are very few controls on what people are allowed to plant in their yards or what nurseries are allowed to sell them. And so we're continually seeing new species appearing in our forests. And until we come up with better policy solutions and preventative measures, this is just going to continue and likely get worse in the future. And so it needs to be a combination of on-the-ground stewardship and conservation efforts, as well as real policy solutions and changes in our cultural preferences for what we like to see planted in our landscapes, in our yards and schools and businesses. The good news is that in those exclosures that we studied, we actually saw the native species bounce back on their own without any effort whatsoever. So we studied places that invasives had not been suppressed by people, either cutting or herbiciding or anything. And you can see that in the exclosures that we studied, the lianas and the herbs really bounced back dramatically. That if you just remove deer from the equation, many of our own native species can outcompete the invasives on their own. The one exception that we consistently found in the forest that we studied was the shrubs. And the reason why the shrubs didn't recover to the same degree is that in our area of New Jersey, the forests are highly fragmented and the shrub layer has been depleted for so long that there really wasn't a good seed source around to fuel the recovery of the shrub layer in these forests that have been protected. And on top of that, there were abundant invasive shrubs around. So many invasive shrubs actually responded beneficially to the removal of deer as well. So in order to recover the shrub layer, it's likely to take more than just tackling the deer problem, but may well require additional work like planting or seeding in native shrubs. We're thinking about suppressing invasive shrubs at the same time so our natives can get an advantage and bounce back, because they do increase. They just don't increase as fast as the invasives do, at least in the forest that we studied. But again, just seeing how the natives respond on average in general is really good cause for optimism that if we can just figure out how to tackle the deer part of the equation, much of the rest will fall into place on its own. The third major category of issues that I wanted to bring up is one that, again, that's indirectly related to both deer and bird populations, and that's forest fragmentation. Deer are, again, an edge species, so the more you create edges in our forests and chop them up into farm fields or suburban subdivisions, the more deer populations are going to have food and cover available to them. But this is also problematic for birds because bird species fall in similar categories. Many birds are edge-loving species, but others are forest interior species that require core parts of forest that are insulated from those edge effects. And the kinds of edge effects that we're concerned about are really varied. This is a study from the Amazon, but the concept applies here as well. That when you look at forest conditions in relation to the distance from the edge, you find that as much as 400 meters into the forest, you get increased wind disturbance as a result of those edges. And that translates into increased tree mortality up to 300 meters into the forest. And then biological factors follow. So you've got changes in butterfly communities and other insects. bird populations, changes in microclimates like sunlight and air temperatures and soil moisture, all to varying degrees depending on distance to the edge. And this subset of bird species like black and white warblers and scarlet tanagers, veeries and ovenbirds and many others really don't respond well to those kinds of conditions and really require the insulated intact forest conditions. And if you look at fragmentation globally, the map there on the top left, anywhere that's colored yellow or orange or red are places where the forests are highly fragmented. And places in blue are forests that are still largely intact, but you can see that they're largely restricted to remote areas of equatorial Africa, the Amazon basin, and Indonesia and New Guinea. And almost all of our forests in North America, Europe, and much of Asia suffer from varying degrees of fragmentation historically and in the present. And fragmentation doesn't just affect things directly, but can lead to long-standing effects, which we refer to as extinction debt. Because many species might be able to survive in the forest patch that's left after the surrounding area is converted to agriculture or development of other kinds. But over time, as those species decline and die, or the populations die, they might have difficulty dispersing back into that forest and recolonizing it. So some species might be able to hang on for decades or centuries, but slowly over time, you start to see decreases in the number of species that those fragments that remain can support. And other ecosystem functions decline over time as well, as you can see there in the bottom right. For bird species, one of the most important factors that lead to them being averse to forest edges is that many small and medium-sized mammal predators like to use forest edges as corridors. Not just deer populations that are affecting vegetation, but you've got coyotes and fox and raccoons and possum and many other species moving along those forest edges and preying upon bird nests that are on the ground in low-lying shrubs or in other ways that are accessible to the forest. And this tends to go up to about 100 meters into the forest from the edge, with decreasing amounts of predation the further you get from the edge. And so this is one of the reasons why many bird species, especially the ground and shrub nesting birds, really rely on those sheltered core forest interiors. In places like New Jersey, almost all of our forests are heavily fragmented. In the first slide I showed you, I think showed that every county in New Jersey, except for one, I think, has an average forest size of 60 acres or less. So our forests are just incredibly chopped up, with very few intact, contiguous, mature forests remaining in the state, at least in the northern part of the state. And so I broke up northern New Jersey into different regions and looked at how understory vegetation responded. And you can see that the places that have the greatest fragmentation, like the Piedmont here, where I'm located, where the smallest forest patches in general, and the Limestone Valley here, which is a lot of agriculture, have much lower levels of saplings and forest vegetation in general compared to the more intact forest environments that you get in the upper highlands above the glacial moraine there in gray, and on the Kittatinny Ridge in places like the Delaware Water Gap and Stoke State Forest, where the forest vegetation has declined, but not nearly as substantially, because there's much less edge habitat favoring rises in deer populations and the kinds of things that we've been talking about. So we were studying bird populations, and this is unfortunately the only look at our data that I can give you, but we were interested in looking at how bird populations in those two categories, forest interior species and the ground and low shrub nesting birds in particular, responded to these area and edge effects, as well as these issues of forest history, whether they were intact old forests or post-agricultural forests. And what we found is that a lot of the species in both categories, but primarily the forest interior species, increased considerably the larger the forest patch. So these patches are from 0 to 100 hectares, 100 to 200 hectares, and then over 200 hectares. And you can see that in general, these species increase in their diversity, in their abundance as the forest size increases. The yellow dots are forests that are intact, and the green dots are the post-agricultural forests. So if you compare the average abundance of those bird species in the old forests to these younger disturbed forests, you can see that consistently across the board, the older forests are supporting more abundant bird populations. And we're not sure exactly why, but we're assuming at this point that it's related to the kinds of vegetation effects that we were outlining earlier. And this is the work that we have to do moving forward to really make clear causal connections between those things. And that's why it's taking so long to put the bird data together with the vegetation, is because it's much more complicated. And again, you can see that as the forest size increases in this one example here, species richness of forest interior species increases much faster and to greater degrees in the old intact forests, which you see in the dotted line there, than in the younger post-agricultural forests in the solid line. And then the last thing that we're studying that we just began last year is looking at forest microclimates. So we picked forest patches with different levels of forest understory vegetation at Duke Farms, and we started installing some microclimate towers to look at how temperature and relative humidity changed, at ground level, shrub level, and sapling level, to see if the vegetation is affecting microclimates in those areas. And we're seeing some promising results so far, but these are of concern for a couple different reasons, not just climate change at the regional level that everybody's interested in now, but temperature and relative humidity are going to affect germination conditions for plants, but it's also going to affect the ability of animals to successfully go through hibernation and torpor for thermoregulation. And we find that places so far that have the greatest density of vegetation, where the forests have recovered the most, have the most moderate temperature and relative humidity changes from night to day across the seasons. So it should be better at supporting the ability of birds to thermoregulate, especially in the wintertime. And that's something that's, again, indirectly related to birds as well as many other species that are occupying these habitats. And of course, I'd be remiss to not mention a few other things. Forest understory vegetation is really important for carbon sequestration. Exposure studies from Virginia found 94% increases in carbon storage in the sapling layer in exposures after 16 to 18 years. And other kinds of nutrients are stored to even greater degrees in the understory vegetation. With nitrogen, for example, as much as 38% of the nitrogen occurring in forest vegetation is just in the understory vegetation. So it's a really important reservoir of nutrients for higher levels in the food chain to be able to depend upon. And deer are, of course, affecting us indirectly through by being the primary vector of ticks in the landscape. Even though deer are not the main reservoir of Lyme disease, they are the main way that ticks are moving through the landscape and that we're being exposed to them. And we find that places that have the greatest densities of deer at the local level have the highest densities of ticks. And of course, Lyme disease is incredibly prevalent in our area of the country. I've had it 4 times myself in the past 15 years and was just fortunate to catch it in time in each case. But I know many people who weren't so lucky. And so we have locally in our area as many as 600 plus cases a year in some of our local counties in New Jersey being reported to the CDC. So there's public health concerns that are affecting us directly, as well as public safety concerns, because the higher deer populations lead to increased risk of deer vehicle collisions. I've hit 4 deer myself in the past 15 years, and I'm not part of these statistics because in each case it was below my deductible, so I didn't report it. But locally, people are reporting to State Farm Insurance and other agencies hundreds of claims each year in local townships in central New Jersey, and I've heard Pennsylvania is even worse in some places. State Farm estimates that reported claims translate into about $4,000 in damages on average just to the vehicles. And so if you add up, do all the math, it translates to about $1 million worth of damage in some of these towns that we're paying piece by piece through our own pockets. And the big picture adds up to a huge amount of economic losses for our communities, not to mention loss of lives, pain and suffering and so forth for people that are actually injured during these collisions. And we found in our research from doing the drone surveys of deer populations that, again, the places that have the highest densities of deer have the highest numbers of deer vehicle collisions. And the places that have done the greatest job at reducing deer populations locally in places like Princeton and Bernards Township found deer vehicle collisions decline in response. So in the early 2000s, Princeton started using sharpshooters to reduce their deer population. And in the first year, they reduced it by 60%. And in that same year, they saw a 60% decline in deer vehicle collisions. So just like we see with tree regeneration and understory vegetation as a whole, bird populations and many other things, if we can correct this issue of deer populations being out of balance, a lot of other things will fall back into place and a lot less work will need to be done. But figuring out how to tackle this issue of deer populations at this regional or continent-wide scale that it's occurring is really a gargantuan effort that's going to take massive coordination of public institutions and a groundswell of awareness and support from the general public to pressure or at least support the politicians and policymakers that are trying to do something about it at the scales that it's occurring. So I have a lot of people to thank for for my parts of these studies, all of our data was collected by our student interns that I owe an extraordinary debt to, that did remarkable work over the past 7 years and continue to do so. So there's some of their smiling faces you can see there. And then many other people, institutions, and groups that partner with us to either fund us, give us permission to study their forests, or support us in other ways. So this is really just in honor of their work and support. And if you want to get in touch with me, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out at any time. I'm happy to talk to anybody interested in the subject. Again, if you're looking for references, case studies, data, anything at all I can provide you to advance these interests, I'm happy to help. And that's my contact information there, and email is the best way to get in touch.
Thank you, Jay. That was a wonderful presentation.
Hopefully there's not too many people sleeping there.
I know I'm not sleeping at all. My mind is just kind of blown away, especially the thoroughness of which you have kind of talked about this subject, and just all of the complicated details on how everything is interconnected, and it's just a wonderful presentation. So thank you. And I guess we'll have to see. Let's just take a quick look and see if we have anybody in the chat here. Forgot to mention, and if anybody had any questions for Jay, they could type those into the chat. And so far, I don't see any questions. Let's see.
So they are sleeping.
Not at all. Not at all.
I'll say something, just because I'm a PA master naturalist, and I thought the presentation was outstanding. And the only reason I don't have questions is because I think you covered everything so effectively that
thank you.
You answered all of them.
Yeah, I have. It's a comment. It says excellent presentation, and that's I would kind of concur with the last speaker. It's just the thoroughness of what you have done, and I did have just a personal question, and I know that there was one study, I think it was down in the Appalachians, and it had talked about coyotes in relation to deer population. And what is the general consensus? Do coyotes have any natural check on deer populations, or none whatsoever?
They do have some effects, primarily in preying on fawns and injured deer. You know, coyotes are much smaller than wolves on average, but what's interesting about coyotes is they're not native to this area. They've expanded from Western states. And in the course of moving from the Rockies to the east, they apparently interbred with wolf populations in the Great Lakes region. And so the genetic composition of the eastern coyotes are actually about 30% wolf on average, which means that they're 30% larger, and in some cases have been found to actually exhibit pack hunting behavior, I've heard. So maybe over time, in the future, that could end up translating into some increased control of deer populations by coyotes, but at the moment, they are not a major factor. Coyotes are present in all the places that we study in New Jersey. They're everywhere. And despite that, you see extraordinary deer populations occurring in those same places. So while they do have an effect, and hunters often, you know, grumble about the coyotes, you know, moving deer around or taking deer away from them, they're really just chipping away at a much larger problem, and they're not really currently having much of an impact, as far as I can tell from our deer surveys or from any research that I've seen in general.
I have a question here. Have there been any studies about how short-term effects of such outbreaks, such as chronic wasting disease or EHD, affects forests?
I have not investigated that. That's a really good question. I mean, you would expect to see with deer populations at the levels that they are, that they'd be succumbing to outbreaks of various kinds. And in some parts of the country, chronic wasting disease is a huge problem. I know it's reached Pennsylvania, but it's not actually in New Jersey. So that's given me an excuse not to focus on that part of the equation, because, you know, it's complicated, but it is a really important part of the equation that I personally, unfortunately, just don't have much to offer. There's other diseases in New Jersey One colloquially is referred to as blue tongue disease, and there's a handful of others as well that have been found to have local impacts. So in some years, at the local level, deer populations will be reduced by outbreaks of certain diseases, but they haven't done anything about deer at the large scale level that we're seeing play out across the state. So those kinds of things are happening. The extent to which chronic wasting is occurring in it specifically or at larger scales, I really unfortunately can't answer.
Yeah, we had, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, we had an outbreak of the blue tongue, and certain local populations, the deer population did crash, but it seems like they have already bounced back very, very quickly.
Yeah, and well, one of the reasons for that, not only do they move in from surrounding areas and replenish the numbers, but there's been an increase in the fecundity of deer over time. You know, 20, 30 years ago, most does would only have one fawn per year. And today in our area, the average is more than 2. So there were some groups locally that were working with local hunters had them actually count the number of fawns inside the does that were killed during the regular hunting season, and found that on average there were 2.25, I believe, fawns per doe. So essentially, if you've got low mortality from winter or hunting in a suburban area, the population can essentially double in a single year. And that's just staggering in terms of what that means for management, for conservation and so forth. But that's probably one of the reasons why they were able to bounce back so quickly, as you saw.
I have another question here. What can we do to help plant native trees, shrubs, plants, write letters to the government leaders regarding invasive species sales, anything else?
In terms of plantings, you know, to tackle the invasive species issue, again, prevention, I think, is the best solution for the long term. And so making sure that the things that you plant or your business is planting or your schools are planting are native species so that you're not contributing to this problem of invasives in the landscape is a good first place to start. In terms of restoring our forests, planting makes sense in places where there are currently no forests, but we actually looked at the economics of replanting forest understories compared to deer exclosures. And since we know exactly how many trees used to be in our forests in the mid-20th century, we can actually estimate the exact costs of replacing them and planting them artificially. And on our campus, as an example, we have a 76-acre forest on our campus, and replanting the forest that we have on just that 76 acres would cost $500,000 to pay for all those seedlings and saplings and shrubs. And then the deer would just come back and eat them anyway if we didn't tackle that problem. If we fenced off all those forest patches, the fencing's expensive too. It would cost about $100,000 to $200,000, but the forest would essentially replant themselves much more effectively than we ever could, because the seeds are falling from the canopy year after year, and if you just eliminate the predation of those seedlings by the deer, the forests are much better at planting themselves than we are. So I think for forest restoration at the scale that we needed to occur at, we really have to tackle this issue of deer populations. And there's various directions that can go in, from changing hunting regulations, subsidizing programs like Hunters Helping the Hungry so that hunters can donate venison to feeding for food pantries and shelters. But really at the scale that it's occurring, the only thing that I think, aside from reintroducing wolves and cougars to the landscape, which personally I'm a big fan of, but I don't think politically it's ever going to fly, the only other solution that I can really see as being practical and feasible at that scale is a return to a much more regulated but essential commercial hunting of deer. If we created economic incentives where people were actually allowed to sell deer meat on the market, which they're currently not, that would create economic motivations for people to take more deer than they might personally need. Most hunters will only take 1 or 2 deer in a given year, because not only is it a lot of time and effort that it takes to do that, but they have conservation in mind. They're not trying to necessarily reduce the deer population. They just want some meat for the fridge or a trophy for their wall. And so there needs to be incentives for hunters to take more than they personally need. And while feeding the hungry is a great opportunity and possibility for what we can do with a lot of that venison, personal economic gain is an even better motivator, unfortunately. And that could do a lot of good, I think, to help people both individually or potentially in other ways contribute to reducing deer populations. The risk there, and the reason why I'm nervous, with that idea, is that we nearly drove deer to extinction 100 years ago with systems like that. So it would have to be done in a really careful and controlled and highly regulated manner for it to allow it to both be effective, but to make sure that it doesn't go too far and eliminate deer entirely from local landscapes, because we do need deer around. And so striking that balance, I think, will be difficult, but finding ways to open up market hunting in some fashion, I think, would do a tremendous amount of good to help at least bring down deer populations quickly in large scales in the ways that we need that to happen.
I think, let's see, one more question here. How has the rise in black bears in New Jersey affected deer populations, if at all?
It's similar to coyotes. They do affect deer. They will take fawns out, and I've heard that bear are the only species that can actually smell a fawn, so they can find them and take them. But primarily the deer as it dies. But the bear are not taking adult deer in large numbers at all. And so while they do provide some, benefits as far as deer population control goes, again, just like coyotes, bear occur in every county in New Jersey at this point, and they're not doing anything to keep deer populations down because they're already 10 times the background level here. So I don't have much hope that bear are a good solution to this issue, at least alone.
Yeah. I think we'll leave it at that. I really appreciate your time, Jay. Wonderful presentation. And for those who know of somebody who missed this presentation, know that it's been recorded, and you'll be able to look that up from our website to review again. I think that the information you have provided is going to be really important. Mostly for the future generations. Might be a little bit late for my generation, but hopefully in another 10 to 20 years, maybe we can start to see some changes, and that will affect our bird population significantly. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for your presentation.
It was my pleasure, and best wishes to all of you. Thanks.
Thank you.